Hi team, in this quick video I'm going to speak to the difference between the short run and the long run Phillips curve. So on the left hand side you can see the short run Phillips curve gives us the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And so basically if we were talking about point A, we're talking about a situation where unemployment is, we might call it the natural rate of unemployment, which we know is equal to about 5%. And then that's characterized with a price level equal to PL1, which we might call sort of 2 to 3% inflation growth over time. Now, I want you for a moment to imagine a scenario where over on the right-hand side in our new classical diagram, there's an increase in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. Now, we're very familiar with this scenario by now. We know that based on the new classical model that this is a short-run phenomena and that in the long run it will self-correct. So we know in the short run we're going to move from a position of the natural rate of output to Y1, that's creating that inflationary gap, and use the terminology inflationary gap. We know that obviously comes with an increase in the inflation rate from PL1 to PL2. So we start, if we go back to the left-hand side for a moment, we start in our short-run Phillips curve at a point A, but assuming that there's an increase in aggregate demand, we start to see that inflationary pressure. And so I'm going to imagine for a moment that because of what's happening in the diagram on the right-hand side, we're going to move to point B on our short-run Phillips curve. So what's happening at point B? At point B, we're seeing an increase in the price level from PL1 to PL2. Now, from a technical perspective, that's the same shift in the price level on our neoclassical model. So what's happening here is the same thing as what's happening here. But because the short-run Phillips curve attempts to illustrate the relationship between inflation and unemployment, what's going to happen along our x-axis is obviously a little bit different. So we can see over here that there's been an increase in output. And so if there's an increase in output, that's going to lead to an increase, obviously, in the demand for labor. So an increase in the demand for labor, which we know is characterized by a decrease in unemployment. So guess what? As per our short-run Phillips curve, we should start to see a decrease in unemployment from unemployment 1 to unemployment 2. And so in the short run, this graph here, the short-run Phillips curve as a model gives us a really clear idea of what's going to happen in terms of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment in our short run, okay? And that's primarily driven by an increase in aggregate demand. If you apply this thinking to the opposite outcome, for example, a decrease in aggregate demand, you will reach the same outcome, okay? Now, this is where it gets tricky as per, the neoclassical model. When we studied it, obviously it doesn't just sit pretty in the short run. Eventually we're going to move back to the long run, and we know that that's because in the long run the price of resources becomes variable, namely wages. So without going into the minutiae of it all, we know that in the long run the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left, and it's going to get us back to a point where we return to the natural rate of output, but unfortunately the consequence of that is an increase in our price level once again to PL3. Now, this is where the short-run Phillips curve isn't going to cut it anymore, because unfortunately the relationship between unemployment and inflation that's being illustrated in the neoclassical model no longer applies to our short-run Phillips curve. Now, this is where your long-run Phillips curve kicks in. Now, your long-run Phillips curve is a nice straight line. Oh, I drew that a bit poorly. Just imagine it's a nice straight line down. Long-run Phillips curve, and basically the long-run Phillips curve dictates that we're always going to return back to the natural rate of unemployment, because that's tied closely to the natural rate of output. The two things go hand in hand, and we know that ballpark figures, it's around 3.5% in terms of real GDP in terms of the natural rate of output, and that marries with a 5% unemployment rate in the long run. So those two things come back to what you could call homeostasis, and suddenly point B doesn't work anymore. Point B can't persist in the long run. But let's have a look at what's happened here. Ultimately, because the neoclassical model has returned back to the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of output, we know that the natural rate of unemployment is going to return to 5%. So in terms of our long-run Phillips curve, that's working, okay? At this point, we're going to create a new point on the long-run Phillips curve to dictate where we are now, and we're happy with the location of the long-run Phillips curve because it shows us that no matter where we decide to place our intersection, it's going to lead to an outcome where the unemployment is equal to 5%. And so what happens, team, is if you can imagine PL3 sneaking in here, effectively what's happening is there's a new short-run Phillips curve. short run Phillips curve 2. And if that intersection in there is going to marry up with that intersection in our neoclassical model to the right-hand side. So the long run Phillips curve doesn't shift. It's a nice vertical line straight through the middle, and effectively it is cause for creating a new point of reference where inflation and unemployment will then be able to demonstrate that relationship in reference to what's going on with real GDP, okay? So the short run Phillips curve will always come back to a point where your unemployment rate is equal to 5%, but what's going to change, obviously as per the changes in your neoclassical model is ultimately what's going on with the price level over time. And so as we start to see inflationary pressures change or ultimately disinflation or deflation, there's no reason why over the long run, the short run Phillips curve will continue to shift up and to the right, but in periods of disinflation or deflation, it will start to come back down to the left as well. Okay, so ultimately, key takeaways are in your short run, you've got a really lovely relationship between inflation and unemployment that you can speak to that's exclusive to changes in aggregate demand. And in the long run, we have that nice vertical long run Phillips curve that gets us back to 5% unemployment every single time, and obviously leads to changes in the price level depending on what's going on in our macro economy. Cool. Hopefully that makes sense.